The first 8 seconds are nothing but silence, then the faint sound of iron striking iron, a hammer echoing against steel, a sound that built America, but beneath that sound was another, a wet tearing, a muffled scream swallowed by the desert winds. The Union Pacific Railroad's march through Utah in 1867 promised prosperity, but it carried something darker, an appetite. For decades, scattered reports surfaced of workers vanishing without explanation. Men were hired, then gone within days, their names scratched off rosters as though they had never lived. No records, no graves, no wages collected by family, just the iron rails continuing westward. And then there were the whispers. Half-starved men swore the stew in the work camps tasted strange, metallic, and sweet. Some claimed bones were pulled from the ash pits at dawn. The officials dismissed it all as desert madness, but the desert remembers. And what it remembers, it does not forgive. The Union Pacific workforce was built on expendability. Irish immigrants, freedmen, Chinese laborers, and convicts promised release if they laid track across the wasteland. Thousands moved earth and steel, but the records of who lived and who died are incomplete by design. Those who went missing were written off as deserters. Yet one letter, preserved in the archives of the Salt Lake Territorial Church, tells another story. A foreman wrote in 1867, "The men grow hungry, hungrier than any beast I have known. At night they whisper that the stew is not what it seems. I myself found a tooth in my portion. That tooth was filed away in the church's collection." It did not belong to an animal. It bore the unmistakable wear of a man who had smoked a pipe for years. How did it end up in a kettle of stew meant for 60 starving workers? Camp 47 sat along the Weber River, near where Ogden stands today. No maps mark its existence, but diaries whisper of it. A shanty town of canvas tents, flickering lanterns, and men coughing themselves to sleep. Hunger was constant. The supply trains rarely arrived on time, and when they did, sacks of grain were often infested or spoiled. One worker, a Chinese man known only as Liang, wrote in a tattered journal found decades later, "They serve us meat, but from where? I see no cattle, no deer, nothing, yet the pot is always full. Men vanish, the meat is replenished, we are not allowed to ask." By December, nearly half the camp's original men had disappeared. Official records listed them as walk-offs, but where did they walk? The desert holds no mercy. The bones that surface today along the Weber are gnawed clean, not by coyotes, but by teeth eerily human. The hunger wasn't a secret, it was sanctified. A missionary from Salt Lake visited the camp that winter, claiming to bring blessings from God. His sermons were not of scripture, but of sacrifice. He spoke of the Israelites consuming flesh in times of famine. He said, "The Lord feeds his faithful however he must. Do not question what is set before you." Workers remembered his eyes, hollow, shining, fanatical. After his visit, the camp's leaders enforced silence. Men who asked questions were chained, beaten, or disappeared. The stewpots grew fuller, not emptier. When the missionary returned months later, he asked only one question: do they eat with obedience? Behind the railroad's expansion was an endless demand for cheap bodies. Local orphanages, already brimming with abandoned children, struck deals with contractors. Boys as young as 11 were handed over to the camps. Their names were erased, their lives swallowed by steel and hunger. In Ogden, a ledger still survives, water-stained and incomplete. Next to the names of 20, for orphans is a single word repeated like a curse: feeding. Historians assume it meant rations provided to the boys. But in context, paired with their sudden disappearance, it begins to mean something else entirely. When questioned decades later, one orphanage matron, aged and half mad, whispered, "The boys didn't starve, they fed the work. They became the work." Travelers along the construction route wrote of a smell that never left the camps. Not the sharp tang of sweat or rust, but something heavier: copper, marrow, and smoke. When wagons passed by, children covered their noses, claiming the wind carried the stink of cooked men. Bones were sometimes found scattered along the embankments, shattered as if struck with hammers. Officials claimed they were the remains of cattle brought in from neighboring settlements, but local ranchers swore no herds had ever been sold. The question lingered: if not cattle, then who? The Donovan family lived near Echo Canyon, their homestead pressed against the tracks. In 1867, the father, Patrick, signed on as a railroad worker. His wife and 2 children stayed in the cabin. That spring, all 4 vanished. Their house was found abandoned, door swinging open, table still set for dinner. The only sign of them was a child's shoe in the ash heap of Camp 47, its leather blackened, its buckle half melted. Union Pacific records mark Donovan as absconded. His children are never mentioned, but locals whispered of stew that ran rich that week, bowls passed out with unusual generosity. Rumors reached the church in Salt Lake. But instead of condemnation, there was silence. Some say silence is complicity. Others say silence is blessing. Surviving correspondence between church elders hints at knowledge too dangerous to name. The work must be finished. The rails are the veins of God's nation. Do not inquire into the meat. The Lord provides as He wills. To this day, none of the church's archives from that year can be accessed without permission. Files have been sealed, labeled restricted. What is so dangerous about the hunger of 1867 that it must still be buried 150 years later? Decades later, an old cook who once served at Camp 47 confessed on his deathbed. His testimony was written down by his daughter, who later burned it in terror, except for one page she dared keep. It reads, "They brought me the bodies at night, told me to cut away the faces, the hands, anything that might speak of who they were. The men ate with no complaint. Hunger does not ask questions, but I never stopped hearing them chewing. Even in my dreams, the chewing never ends." Some historians quietly admit, without the bodies, the railroad would not have been finished. Supplies were too scarce, the land too unforgiving, men fed on men, and rails advanced westward. Every mile was not just laid with sweat and blood, but with marrow, sinew, and ash. Survivors described the meals in cryptic terms. The meat gave us strength. The meat made us work. Some even spoke of visions, seeing the rails stretch endless, shimmering like veins of a living beast, pulsing with hunger. The Utah desert has its own way of keeping secrets. The dry earth preserves bones for centuries. In the 1920s, workers laying telephone lines near the Weber unearthed a pit of skeletons. They bore tool marks not from animals but knives. The bones were cracked, marrow sucked clean. Authorities quietly reburied them. The newspapers ran no story, but locals remember. They call it the Pit of Workers. To this day, hikers claim the ground there feels soft, as if the earth itself is still digesting. In Ogden and Salt Lake, families of railroad men tell of strange dreams passed down through generations. Children wake screaming, saying they saw their fathers in chains, boiling in great iron pots. Some claim they tasted blood in their mouths upon waking. Psychologists call it inherited trauma, but the old families call it something else, the debt of the rail. They say the railroad still feeds, not in flesh, but in memory. Every descendant carries a bite of the forbidden feast. Locked in the Union Pacific archives is a ledger labeled Expenditures, Camp 47. It lists wages, tools, food shipments, and something else. Next to every missing man's name is a single mark, a cross. No burial records, no dismissals, just crosses, pages of them, like a cemetery bound in leather. Researchers who viewed it say the paper itself carries a smell, not mold, not dust, but something sour, metallic, unmistakable. The scent of blood that never fades. Liang, the Chinese worker who kept a journal, vanished in March of 1867. His final entry reads, "They come at night. I hear them dragging something heavy. I will not eat any more. I will starve before I join them. If they take me, let this book be my voice." His body was never found. His journal ends with a single, unfinished line, "They are boiling," and then the page is torn. It was not only the desperate who ate. Testimonies whisper that the overseers, the well-fed men who carried whips instead of picks, took part in the feasts willingly. They were said to sit apart, carving flesh with silver knives, drinking whiskey, laughing as the men below shivered in hunger. Theirs was not survival, theirs was indulgence and perhaps ritual. Some describe the overseers cutting flesh with deliberate ceremony, as though honoring something older than hunger. By 1868, the railroad was hailed as a miracle, but for those who knew the truth, it was an altar. Each tie was a coffin, each rail a sacrament. Workers were not merely men, they were offerings. In some diaries, metaphors slip through. The rail drinks well tonight. The steel sings when fed. Were these figures of speech? Or confessions, the rail itself became an idol of appetite, carrying its hunger across the nation. Investigators who seek the truth today find the trail deliberately obscured, birth records missing, death certificates forged, church files sealed, even census counts fail to align with the number of men hired. It is as though an invisible hand scraped away the evidence, leaving only whispers and unease. But silence is a language. And in that silence, the truth breathes like a wound that never heals. Accidents plagued the railroad for decades, derailments, explosions, inexplicable collapses. Survivors often reported hearing chewing in the moments before catastrophe. Some said they smelled stew boiling when no pot was near. Workers refused to sleep near the tracks, claiming the ground murmured beneath them. Perhaps the hunger did not end in 1867. Perhaps it traveled with the rails, feeding forever. In 1954, during renovations near Ogden, a buried cellar was unearthed. Inside were rusted cooking pots, bones stacked like cordwood, and a child's toy wagon blackened with soot. The discovery was quietly removed, never reported. But one photograph survives, smuggled into private hands. It shows a long table, bowls arranged neatly, waiting for guests who would never leave. The railroad is celebrated as America's triumph, a symbol of progress. But what is progress if it is built on bones? The hunger of 1867 was buried, but it was never appeased. Families remember, dreams persist, and the desert keeps its secrets. Every mile of track from Utah to California may carry not just steel and wood, but marrow, blood, and silence. And when the trains scream through the night, some say they do not hear engines. They hear chewing, and the chewing never ends.